All right, guys, well, let's continue. We've actually covered thus far 2 arguments for God's existence. And so as we told you in the beginning, that's the first stage, that's the first major question that has to be answered. Now, we could do so many more arguments for God's existence, and don't worry, we're not going to. But just so you understand, there are over 24 solid arguments for God's existence. We just did 2. And just to encourage you, the sessions are not going to be as long as that one. That's the longest session all day, so take hope. But there are so many great arguments for God's existence. We did the cosmological and the design argument. So already we're on very, very good grounds for knowing and believing that absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, the scientific and the philosophical evidence shows us that a creator absolutely exists. The beginning of the universe, and then also the fact that the human body contains design. So we've answered that first and primary question. Does God exist? The evidence declares a resounding yes. But here's the second question. What kind of God exists? This is a big question. What kind of God exists? In other words, where should we now look? We know that there is a creator. We know in a general sense, but should we now believe in the God of Islam? Should we believe in the God of Judaism? Should we look to the 300 million gods of Hinduism? We know that there is a God, but where should we look? Now, we're not going to waste time looking at the other 24 world religions. We're just going to essentially make a beeline to the Holy Scriptures, to the Bible. And here's the reason why. Because the qualities of the Creator that we've already talked about from these 2 arguments, there are only 3 possibilities, 3 world religions that are even in the ballpark of possibility. As you look at the cosmological argument and the design argument, the only 3 world religions that even have a chance of answering that creator, it would be the God of Islam, or the God of Judaism, or the God of Christianity. Buddhism is automatically eliminated. Hinduism is eliminated. Baha'i and Shintoism and all these other religions are automatically disqualified because the evidence doesn't point to them. It points to a personal, singular creator who is transcendent, immaterial, etc., like we talked about. And out of those 3, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, we're just going to make a beeline right for the Old Testament and examine the Scriptures. In a general sense, all of them base themselves off the Old Testament anyway. But what we're going to do, and this is what you can do in your conversation with people, rather than taking a lot of time and disproving Islam or disproving Hinduism or disproving Buddhism, rather than doing the negative, just go for the positive. And just tell your friends, hey, let me just help you save a lot of time. Let's look at Christianity because it's the only worldview that's really true and supported by the evidence. So we've answered the question, does God exist? The answer is yes. And now we're going to look to this book that we love, that we cherish, that you read, that you study, to answer the question, what kind of God exists? So now there's a whole nother issue that we have to tackle. When you read this book, this is very practical. When you read this book, can you trust it? When you read this book, is this just a collection of myths and stories and, fanciful imagination from the ancient Hebrews and a couple of guys 2,000 years ago? Or is this book evidential? Is it rock solid? Because most of you, perhaps all of you, you base your life on this book. You raise your families on this book. You're even betting and placing your eternity on the truth of this book. So a really great question for you to ask. Now that we know God exists, is this the book that describes the God that does exist? So what we're going to do now until lunchtime, and the sessions are going to be shorter, don't worry. What we're going to be doing is we're going to examine this book in 2 ways. We're going to see, number 1, is this a reliable, trustworthy human book? In other words, just in a human perspective, is this a book where we can trust the manuscripts? Was this book reliably copied? Was it handed down to us to a degree of accuracy that we can trust? Is the history and the archaeology that's referenced in this book, is that reliable? And if we can establish that it's a good enough human book to be a foundation for us, then we're going to see, does it have any divine signature? Because it could be a reliable human book, but not from God. It could be a great historical, verified book, but not be written by the Lord. And so that last session, we're going to talk about the divine signature on the Bible. So we're going to talk about, first of all, as I said, the manuscript evidence for God's Word. And again, we're going to be talking about now how accurately has the Bible been copied and how have those manuscripts, those copies, been passed down to us. And as we've usually done, we're going to start it off by showing you guys a short video.
I actually believe the Bible for many reasons, but for me, one of the crucial issues is the actual manuscript availability that we find within the sources. My understanding is that a historical source is only as good as the documents that it sits upon, and the evidence for the New Testament documents is extremely strong, particularly when you compare the source material for the secular sources of the time. Two of the earliest biographies of Alexander the Great, for example, are written 400 years or so after his death by Arrian and by Plutarch, are considered by historians to be the strongest evidence for his life. And yet we're still finding them 400 or 500 years after he died in 323 BC. And yet for me the remarkable thing is that historians are still prepared to treat this as a key source document. And the same is true for some of the lateness of the manuscripts. If you take, for example, the Annals of Tacitus, written maybe 100 or 110 AD, the earliest available manuscript for him is not found until 850 AD. It's the same for the letters of Pliny, it's the same for the lives of Suetonius. The Bible manuscript evidence is much more compelling than some of the secular sources. If you take the earliest surviving codices of the New Testament, Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, they both date from around about the middle of the 4th century AD. Now that immediately closes the window on the sources to a much shorter period than, for example, the Annals of Tacitus or the works of Pliny. And we can even push it further than that. If you take the earliest surviving manuscript fragment, which is one of the Rylands papyri held in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, we actually find that there's an early fragment of the Gospel of John. It contains just a few verses from John chapter 18. And it was found in Egypt, and historians have dated it to around about 125 or 130 AD. Now even the most liberal scholars will tell you that John, the Gospel writer, John the Apostle, died in the AD 90s, or perhaps as late as AD 100. So when you consider that this gospel fragment of his is available 25 or 30 years after that, we get this remarkable piece of evidence that the scribe who was perhaps recording the fragment that we have was alive at the time that John the writer himself was alive. In other words, what the document does is take us right to the very heartbeat of the gospel message, and it gives us something really significant to work with. Now you can add to this the number of manuscript copies which are still available. There are 8 copies, for example, for Herodotus, one of the so-called fathers of history. There's 7 copies of some of Aristotle's work. There's 20 copies left of Tacitus. And yet there's somewhere between 20,000 and 24,000 New Testament documents or New Testament fragments surviving. I suppose really the bottom line is this. The biographer of Jesus, who takes a look at the gospel records as recorded in the New Testament, is on much safer ground and much surer ground than the biographer of, for example, Julius Caesar, or Alexander the Great, or Pliny the Younger. And I don't hear anybody arguing the evidence for their existence at any point in time. For me, the New Testament manuscript evidence is compelling enough, but if you add to that the most remarkable archaeological discovery of the 20th century, it seems that both the Old Testament and the New Testament documents stand up to scrutiny. Back in 1947, an Arab goat herder near Qumran, around the area of the Dead Sea, threw a stone into a cave, and he heard a strange noise. So he went to investigate and found in the cave and in caves nearby a variety of clay jars, and in the jars were leather documents. And what he didn't realise at the time, but what archaeologists and historians have later discovered, is that he had found what's become known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, the most incredible manuscript discovery of the 20th century. The Dead Sea Scrolls have been dated to around about 100 BC. They're the most convincing and most complete record that we have of both Old Testament and New Testament manuscripts. It seems that there were some monastic farmers living around the area in the 1st century AD, and when the Romans took Jerusalem in AD 70, they tried to hide their manuscripts and hide their documents in these jars in the caves. One of the scrolls contains all 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah. And it's remarkable because it also antedates the previous oldest copy of the book of Isaiah by nearly 1,000 years. The Masoretic text was around 900 or 1000 AD. This Dead Sea Scrolls copy is from around 100 BC. Normally you'd expect remarkable changes in a document over 1,000 years. That's a pretty long period of time. And yet what's remarkable for scholars of the Dead Sea Scrolls is that that copy of Isaiah found in the caves in Qumran is virtually identical to the later Masoretic copy that dates from 900 or 1000 AD. You would expect to find many more changes than you do, and even the changes and the variations which are there are pretty negligible. They certainly don't impact on anything central to the gospel or central to Isaiah's message. I spent a lot of time working with old manuscripts and working with old books, and it seems to me that the Bible more than passes the tests that historians lay down when they work with ancient source material. And I find that that means that when I come to the Bible, or when anyone else comes to the Bible, they can treat it not merely as a book of old documents, a book of old manuscripts, but as something living and powerful, containing a message for us today.
All right, so can we trust the biblical manuscripts? You know, this is a really important question to ask yourself, because as you sit there at your house and you read the Bible and do devotions, as you look to the Bible and you give instruction to your children, the paper, the copies that it's based on, are they real? Have they been changed? Have they been altered? Are some of the atheists right like Bart Ehrman that says there are over 25,000 errors in the Bible? And though he went to seminary, he fell out of Christianity and said it's absolutely untrustworthy and untrue. Is he right? This is a really important question to ask yourself. Can we trust our Bibles? So we're going to begin first, as I said, by examining the Old Testament. We're going to do this rapidly. I don't expect you to remember the names of the manuscripts. What I want you to walk away with from this is to realize that there are lots of good manuscripts, and I want you to just remember those two words you see on the screen. The quantity and the quality of the Old Testament manuscripts is greater than any other book in the ancient world. Let me say that again. The major thing you need to remember is that the quality of the book that you hold in your hands, Old and New Testament, it is the most reliable ancient book in the history of mankind. So let's examine this real quick. First of all, the quantity of the Old Testament manuscripts. How many are there? Well, there's about 10,000 manuscripts of the Old Testament. As we'll come to see in just a little bit, most other ancient books might have 2 copies, 5 copies, maybe 100, but yet the Old Testament has over 10,000 manuscript copies, and their dates range from 250 BC to 1100 AD. Let me give you quickly some of the names and images of the actual manuscript copies for your Old Testament. First of all, we have the Oriental 4445 manuscript. It dates from 820 to 850 AD. It has the book of Genesis, Deuteronomy, and Numbers in it. It's housed in the British Museum, and we have a picture of that for you. We also have the Codex Kyrensis. It is from AD 895, and it contains the former and the latter prophets. We also have a picture of that manuscript for you as well. Next, we have the Aleppo Codex. It is dated from AD 930. It's in very good condition, and it contains the entire Old Testament. It's housed in Hebrew University. We have an image of that for you. We also have the Codex Leningradensis, and as you might guess by the name, it's housed in Leningrad. It's dated from 1008 AD, and it is a complete Old Testament manuscript. We have a picture of that as well. We also have Cairo Geniza. This is dated from AD 929 to 1121, and a pretty interesting manuscript. There's an image of that as well. The most important Old Testament manuscript that you should be aware of, as was mentioned in the video, are the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls, this was the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. In 1947, as it said in the video, this was in the Qumran area around the Dead Sea, and a really interesting story. You know, never underestimate how the Lord can use sovereign circumstances in your life. There's a dad working, and his son is going along with him. He was a goat herder. And so the boy was there throwing rocks at the goats. I don't know if that was approved by his dad or not, but he missed one of the goats, and the rock shot past him into a cave, and then he heard the sound like clay pottery breaking. So then into this cave walked the father and son, and they discovered the greatest archaeological find of the 20th century. The manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls. The reason why they are more important is because they are 1,000 years older than any of their manuscripts that I just told you about. And the reason that's valuable for us is we can examine the accuracy of the Dead Sea Scrolls compared to the manuscripts that we already have to see if the biblical text changed. If we go back to that previous slide, as we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's different aspects to it, different scrolls. There was the Paleo-Exodus from 250 BC, a Samuel fragment, a Leviticus scroll, Hosea, Isaiah. Actually, the entire scroll of Isaiah is found there. It's about an 80-feet scroll. And it's an extremely valuable find, the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the quantity and the quality of the Old Testament manuscripts is absolutely superior. Let's talk about the quality really quick. The quality and the accuracy of the Old Testament manuscripts is known from several practices. So we know that the quantity, over 10,000, is a tremendous number, greater than any other ancient book in ancient history. But now what about the quality? Well, first of all, we can compare the Old Testament manuscripts with the Greek translation. Nobody really spoke Hebrew in the days of Jesus unless you were a religious professional. You see, Alexander the Great, he had conquered the world in about 300 BC. And so Hellenism, or the spreading of Greek culture and customs, it went throughout the modern world. So everybody essentially spoke Greek. But the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they spoke Hebrew. So what happened, because everybody spoke Greek, is 70 scholars translated the Old Testament into Greek about 200 BC or so. So if we compare the Old Testament Hebrew manuscripts with the Greek Septuagint translation, we can find the accuracy. Another way that we can determine the accuracy of the Old Testament manuscripts is by learning the careful practice of the Jewish scribes. If you understand how careful and how meticulous the Jewish scribes were as they copied these manuscripts, it's very impressive. Let me read to you the 10 rules of the scribe, and we have a slide for this as well. First of all, they engaged in a ritual cleansing and a bathing before writing the name of God. The name of God, Yahweh, YHVH, appears 7,000 times in the Old Testament, more or less. These were some squeaky clean dudes, because every time that they wrote that name beforehand, they would take a bath and wash the filth off of them. Secondly, one of their rules was they must ignore all conversation if writing God's name. There was no copying from memory allowed. They must have a manuscript in front of them. Their scrolls had to have equal amounts of columns. All the letters and columns were counted. The parchment or papyrus had to be lined before starting. Each of their columns had to extend downwards 48 to 60 lines. The scribes had to be dressed in complete Jewish attire, and old or errant copies of the scriptures were ritually destroyed, and while they wrote, they had to be aware of the conscious presence of God. So let me just ask you, did they take their job seriously? Very seriously. Why? Because they knew and they believed they were copying the words of God. These men knew how many of the letter A, how many of the letter H were on different pages. They had a tremendous memory, and as you can see, they exercised tremendous skill in the copying. A third way that we can verify the quality and the accuracy is by comparing parallel passages. So there are certain passages in the Bible that have the same information, like Psalm 18 and 2 Samuel 22. As you compare the different books of the Bible with each other on these parallel passages, you can check for accuracy. A fourth way we can verify that is the large number of Hebrew manuscripts. If you have 10,000 copies, you can make 10,000 comparisons, and you can verify accuracy much more easily than with 5 copies or with 10 copies. Number 5, you can cross-check with the Dead Sea manuscripts, which are 1,000 years earlier, which, as I told you, they have done. And the percentage of comparison is about 99% the same or higher. And finally, we can compare the Old Testament with other ancient books. As you can see in this next slide, the number of copies of the Old Testament, you see that orange bar at the top, 10,000? Look at how it compares to the number of manuscript copies of other ancient books. The only other book that even comes close is Homer, who has 643 copies. After that, it's Demosthenes. But everybody else, Plato, 7 copies. Tacitus, 20. Caesar, 10. Now, this is amazing because you're never going to hear that. If you go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble, or if in the university, if, let's say, you wanted to base your academic career on studying the works of Plato, your professor will never tell you that Plato has 7 manuscript copies. He'll never tell you that. And even if he did, if you asked your professor, but that's only 7 copies, can I trust those manuscripts? And he would say, of course you can. It's Plato. But if we're consistent, if they can trust 7 copies, can you trust 10,000 copies as we compare it in all those different ways? Absolutely. Miller Burroughs, he's an expert on the Dead Sea Scrolls, he said this: "It is a matter of wonder that through something like 1,000 years, the text underwent so little alteration. Herein lies its chief importance. It supports the fidelity of the Masoretic tradition." In other words, when examining the Dead Sea Scrolls, comparing them with the other manuscripts, it remains the same, although it is 1,000 years earlier. So there's tremendous confidence in the Old Testament manuscripts. Gleason Archer, he said this: "Isaiah proved to be word for word identical with our standard Hebrew Bible in more than 95% of the text. The 5% of variation consisted chiefly of obvious slips of the pen and variation in spelling." So Gleason Archer says you have a higher than 95% probability or reason for trusting the accuracy of your Bible. F. Bruce, another scholar, he said this: "It may now be more confidently asserted than ever before that the Dead Sea discoveries have enabled us to answer this question of the reliability of the Old Testament in the affirmative with much greater assurance than was possible before 1948. We know beyond the shadow of a doubt the accuracy and the reliability of the Old Testament because of the Dead Sea manuscripts." So that's the Old Testament. Let me just review for you quickly. The Old Testament has a greater quantity and a greater quality than any other book of antiquity. Homer, Plato, Tacitus, Caesar. The Old Testament, the 39 books that you read and you love and you cherish, you have very good reason for doing so. Why? Because the manuscripts are the strongest of the ancient world in their quantity and their quality. What about the New Testament? Well, the New Testament, in a very similar way, it has the greatest quantity and also the greatest quality, but then it also has a third reason, the immediacy. Those are 3 reasons for trusting these manuscripts. First of all, how many New Testament manuscripts are there? And this is just fascinating, and it rejoices me to talk about this every time, because the atheists, they never like to admit this. As we said before, most ancient books have 10 to 20 manuscripts. Homer's Iliad, maybe some of you have read it, it has 643. It is the secular book with the largest manuscripts outside of the Bible. And again, people base their life on some of these books. They'll base their entire academic profession on these books. But as you compare it with the 27 books of your New Testament, we see that they pale in comparison, because your New Testament has 5,700 Greek manuscripts. And if you add into that all of the Latin copies, the Vulgate, the Syriac, and the Coptic, the total jumps up to about 25,000 copies of your New Testament. And that is just breathtaking. There is no other book in the history of man that is ancient with that many manuscripts. And you see, it's wonderful because you can study it, you can cross-reference it, you can check it to ensure its accuracy. And we have another picture for you. Look at the New Testament as compared to the other books. The number of manuscript copy, it just dwarfs every other ancient book. So it is the number 1 most reliable book in terms of the number of manuscript copies. Number 2, what about the immediacy? This is another great reason for trusting your New Testament, because a good question has to be asked. A copy is wonderful, right? A copy of the original. But a really important question is this: when was that copy made? Was it 5 years after the event? Was it 500 years? Was it 1,000 years after the event? Because the bigger the time gap between the original and the first copy, the bigger the gap, the more likely error or exaggeration or myth can creep in. Are the atheists right? Because they'll tell you, they'll say, the Bible is just an exaggeration. Over the ages and the centuries, mythology creeped in, and originally, they never said Jesus did miracles, but over 300, 400, 500 years, 1,000 years, eventually Jesus became miraculous. Well, let's see what the real evidence would show us. Most other ancient books, on average, have a 1,000-year gap between the original and the first copy. Did you hear that? So Plato wrote his original dialogues, is what they're called, and there's about 1,000 years until the first copy. Now let me ask you, in 1,000 years, is that enough time for error or mistake to creep into the story? Yes. Is it enough time for exaggeration to come in? Absolutely. But compare this with the New Testament. The average time gap for the New Testament manuscripts is somewhere between 25 to 150 years. And I'm just here to tell you, in terms of ancient documents, that is the blink of an eye. 25 years. I've talked to Vietnam veterans who they can give you breathtaking, very specific details, even though it was decades ago. And you have to remember that in this culture, people had oral traditions. They were used to rehearsing stories and reciting events for the family. They were a very skilled culture because they didn't watch TV like we did, which eats your brain, right? So they were used to reciting information and their family history, 25 to 150 year gap. Again, look at this graph and look at the difference in the time gap. You see how large the gray bars are? Herodotus has a gap of 1,400 years. Plato, 1,200. Tacitus, who is called the father of ancient history, he has a 1,000-year gap in his writings. And if you talk to any credible historian, they will believe Tacitus. And they should, because he's a reliable author. But there is a 1,000-year gap in the copies of his book. But look up at the very top of the New Testament. You can't even see it because the time gap is so small. You know what that means? That means when the events happened and that first writing was made, right after that, the copy came in the blink of an eye, which means there was no time for exaggeration, there was no time for myth, no time for error to creep into the copies. Do you understand? That is very, very important when you're reading ancient documents. Manuscript expert Frederick Kenyon, he said this: the interval between the dates of the original composition and the earliest extant evidence becomes so small as to be in fact negligible. And the last foundation for any doubt that the scriptures have come down substantially as they were written, that's all been removed. Both the authenticity and the general integrity of the books of the New Testament may be regarded as finally established. This is a manuscript expert. He dedicates his life to this. He says that all doubt has now been removed because their quantity and their quality, their immediacy, it removes any doubt. Let me show you some of the manuscript copies for the New Testament, just so you can kind of see them with your own eyes. We have the John Ryland papyri. This is the earliest New Testament manuscript in the world. It comes from about 117 AD. It contains 5 verses from John 18 on the front and on the back. And more than likely, the person that actually wrote the John Ryland papyri knew John himself or was within that same generation. That's how early it is. We also have the Bodmer papyri from about 200 AD. It contains most of John, 1st and 2nd Peter, and Jude. We also have the Chester Beatty papyri from 250 AD. It contains nearly all of the New Testament. We have the Codex Vaticanus from 325 to 350 AD, most of the Old and New Testament. The Dean of Archaeology, W.F. Albright, he said this: in my opinion, every book of the New Testament was written by a baptized Jew between the 40s and the 80s of the 1st century AD. In other words, he is testifying in his professional opinion to the immediacy of how soon those original copies were made. Dr. William Lane Craig, he's my favorite Christian philosopher, he says that there are no time for myths to develop in the New Testament manuscripts. He says, the writing of the Greek historian Herodotus enables us to test the rate at which a legend accumulates. The tests show that even the span of 2 generations is too short to allow legendary tendencies to wipe out the hard core of historical fact. So So that shows us the New Testament, which you study and love and hold dear, it is the greatest in terms of its quantity of manuscripts, immediacy, but now let's look at the quality. Number one, the accuracy of the New Testament speaks for its quality, because even the atheist, Bart Ehrman, he even admitted this. In his book, Misquoting Jesus, on page 55, he said this: in fact, most of the changes found in early Christian manuscripts have nothing to do with theology or ideology. Now you got to remember that, because Bart Ehrman, he actually went to school with the other gentleman I showed you, William Lane Craig, but he claims to be an atheist. But he's not an honest man, because here in this quote, he lets you know that most of the errors are irrelevant. But when he talks on YouTube or on TV specials, the biggest thing he loves to say is there's over 250,000 errors. But what he doesn't tell you is an error can be anything as small as a hook of the pen. But of course, that doesn't change the doctrine of the divinity of Jesus or the historical nature of the New Testament. The accuracy of the New Testament has been estimated to be extremely high by numerous scholars. Westcott and Hort, they say that the accuracy is 98.33%. Ezra Abbott, he calculates 99.75%. A.T. Robertson, he's still alive today, 99.9%. So whatever way you cut it, listen, the New Testament manuscripts that you have and you read in your hands are the most accurate ancient book in the history of man. Great reason to trust it. Another reason that gives us great confidence in their quality is the proximity of the New Testament. The writers of the New Testament, they base their work on eyewitness testimony. 15 PhD scholars declare that the New Testament is based on eyewitness testimony because of the details and the specific nature of the facts that they report. Also, the authenticity of the New Testament. The New Testament writers have 12 marks of genuine authenticity. These include things like embarrassing testimony. The disciples in their writings, they'll admit details about themselves that make them look foolish or stupid. The fact that in the New Testament, they admitted the fact that women were the first witnesses of the resurrection. All of these embarrassing details are still in the manuscripts, and it gives a high degree of authenticity for the documents. Also, the unity of the New Testament. Most ancient books have one or two writers, but amazingly, the New Testament has 9 different authors of 27 different books, and they all agree in their teaching and in their doctrine. This is something that really sets the New Testament apart. That most writings, for example, Plato, he was the only guy that wrote his books. Or Julius Caesar, in his annals, he was the only one that wrote them. But the New Testament is unique. There's 9 different authors and 27 different books. And don't you think there could be at least one contradiction or one different doctrine? And there's not. There's an absolute unity which speaks to their quality. So that was super fast, but that's it on the manuscripts. The basic truth for you to remember is that the Old Testament and the New Testament in the ancient world have the highest quantity and the highest quality of manuscripts. They have been incredibly well copied, about 99.75% preserved, and you can trust what you read.